Further, enlightenment maintains against the believer a right which the latter himself concedes when enlightenment regards the object of the believer's veneration as stone and wood, or else as something finite and anthropomorphic. For since this consciousness is divided within itself, having a beyond of the real world and a world that is altogether this side of the world beyond, there is, as a matter of fact, also present in it this view of the thing of sense according to which it counts as a being that is in and for itself. But faith does not bring together these two thoughts of absolute being, which is for it at one time pure essence and at another time an ordinary thing of sense. Even its pure consciousness is affected by the latter view, for the differences of the supersensible world, because this is without the notion, are a series of independent shapes, and their movement is a happening. That is, they exist only in picture thinking and have within them the marks of sensuous existence. Enlightenment, on its side, equally isolates the actual world as an entity forsaken by spirit, isolates determinateness as unmoved finitude, as if it were not even a moment in the spiritual movement of essential being, not nothing, but also not something that absolutely is, but something that is evanescent. Paragraph 567 continues this Enlightenment critique of faith as a form of consciousness. And now we've seen that Hegel has conceded several times that faith, it can present a kind of initial opposition to where enlightenment has been unfair to it, but that there is a deeper, sort of admission that has to be made if faith is going to remain what it's supposed to be, which is a mode of thought, a mode of consciousness. If it's going to attempt to be adequate to itself as a movement of spirit, it has to admit certain things. Now, what's going on in this passage continues that, but there's also a very interesting parallelism that I've represented here between faith and enlightenment that's going to show us some of the emptiness of the enlightenment perspective as well. Let's look at the text first. So he says, enlightenment maintains against the believer a right which the latter himself concedes. The enlightenment is, maintaining a sort of stance, a critical stance, and if the person who's a believer is genuinely motivated in terms of spirit, in terms of thought, they have to admit this. And he says, when enlightenment regards the object of the believer's veneration as stone and wood, or as something finite and anthropomorphic. So, let's think again, what are we talking about here? The object of veneration, the object of action in this case as well. What are we thinking about? It could be a statue. It could be a place, like a temple. Some sort of finite, limited location where there's a differentiation being made between sacred here and profane over there outside. It could be a religious text. It could be something that's movable from place to place. Think of the function of the Ark of the Covenant in ancient Hebrew religion, as we see it depicted in some of the Hebrew scriptures. And we could go on and on and on. All these examples point towards one common feature that Hegel is outlining here. There's something finite, right? It is set apart from other things. Being finite doesn't just mean being limited. It means being limited in relation to other things. And anthropomorphic, made after the form or shape of humanity. Here's where we get into some really interesting, let's call them reflections. Because if you think about what is the nature of the human being in relation to the divine. And let's just take a few examples. What do the Hebrew scriptures, and then this is reaffirmed by, the Christian scriptures, what do they say about the human being? That they are made in the image or after the image, kata to ekon, of God. What Hegel's saying is, yes, but human beings are also making gods after their own image. And this is a long-standing tension within religion. We could call it, intra-religious dialogue if we want to be euphemistic about it. Let's call it intra-religious polemic. That was one of the fundamental criticisms that the early Christians had about the pagan religions, that they were simply anthropomorphizing, and that the human being is really made in the image of God, rather than the opposite way around, doing it that way. The way the pagans are doing it is a mistake. And yet at the same time, they have a very anthropomorphic religion, because they have this figure, Jesus Christ, right, who's showing up, God as human. And we could go on and on and on with examples of this. So coming back to the text, right? Hegel says, since this consciousness, what's this consciousness? The consciousness of faith is divided within itself. How is it divided within itself? He tells us it has a beyond of the real world, a jenseits, the on the other side, something going past that. So we've already seen this in the unhappy consciousness section, right? It has a beyond of the real world and a world that is altogether this side of the world beyond, right? So we have a dividing line here that we can draw. But it's kind of a shifting line because, depending on where you are sort of in the development of the theology, what counts as beyond might be, further beyond. Some things that are of the world might be considered beyond for a while, then they get cast on this side, worldly, right? So he says there's a matter of fact also present in it, this view of the thing of sense, the idol, the statue, the text, whatever it happens to be. The thing of sense, according to which it counts as a being that is in and for itself. But here's the problem. Faith does not bring together these two thoughts of absolute being, which is for it at one time pure essence, and at another time an ordinary thing of sense. Faith may try to do this by talking about the finite thing of the sensuous world as being merely a symbol or a stand-in or a representative. Think, for example, about the Christian reflections on the status of the priest in the celebration of, the central meal. The priest stands, as they say, in loco Christu, right? Christi, rather, in the place of Christ, as an intermediary. Now, Hegel is saying this is all great, but these things have a tendency to come separate from each other. And so there's this emphasis on the beyond as being the real meaning of what's happening here. And something, this connection, this mediation, starts to seem rather arbitrary. So he goes on and he says, faith doesn't bring together these two thoughts, right? Even in its pure consciousness, he says, it's affected by the latter view. For the differences of the supersensible world, because this is without the notion, are a series of independent shapes, and their movement is a happening. They occur in time. So he says they exist only in picture thinking and have within them the marks of sensuous existence. What is Hegel referring to here? Sacred narrative. Sacred narrative becomes a matter of things that are told. So maybe we move away from a statue and now we have the story of what the statue represents. And yet it's still within time. It's still finite in that way. For Hegel, this constitutes a real problem. And this is felt to be a problem by people of faith during the time that he's talking about. Many of them are grappling with this and trying to make sense of it, both within the Protestant spectrum and within the Catholic world of Hegel's time and the centuries just preceding it. So now he says Enlightenment, here's where we get to the parallelism, on its side equally isolates the actual world as an entity forsaken by spirit. Isolates determinateness as an unmoved finitude. So, what are we talking about there? Determinateness as an unmoved finitude. Enlightenment is also setting up a similar kind of this side and beyond, while attempting to bring it all together in one coherent account. But at this point, it's not truly succeeding in this for two reasons. On the one hand, the actual world and the beings within it, including the subject, the human subject who's making sense of this, is too static. That's where faith actually had some sort of advantage. It can tell some pretty cool stories. And Enlightenment stories are not really that gripping, are they? Even in our own time, when we talk about post-Enlightenment, and we're in the late modern or postmodern, and people have a hankering to go back to the Enlightenment. Usually when they tell a story that's, making us, think that the Enlightenment is a great thing, it's because they're telling some heroic tale, which actually looks a lot more like what's going on with faith. It's picture thinking. If we're being really serious about this stuff, it seems kind of anemic. It seems kind of toothless. And this is one of the problems with Enlightenment and with rationalism in general. So he goes on and he says, Enlightenment isolates the actual world as an entity forsaken by spirit, isolates determinateness as unmoved finitude, as if it were not even a moment in the spiritual movement of essential being. The essential being, the supreme being, the subject without predicates, is placed over here, as we've seen, as a void. As something that's, ultimately good, but what does that goodness consist in? We don't really know. Well, we can't understand it through its effects in nature. This is sort of deism talking, right? The natural law that's implanted in us. That's all this worldly, though, isn't it? So he goes on and he says, as if it were not even a moment in the spiritual movement of essential being, not nothing, but also not something that absolutely is, but something that is evanescent. So we have a kind of bifurcation in thought here in the Enlightenment as well. Even the actual world is being treated as if it's a static set of entities, and at the same time as just a happening, as something evanescent. And the question of how it's reconnected with the absolute is still left open. So the Enlightenment is engaging in this critique of faith. Faith, if it's going to be honest with itself, has to admit that it doesn't have its own act together entirely with respect to this. But Enlightenment, Hegel is hinting, also has its own problems. It is clear that the same is the case with the ground of knowledge. Faith itself acknowledges a contingent knowledge, for it has a relationship to contingent things. An absolute being itself exists for faith in the form of a pictorial representation of a common reality. Consequently, the believing consciousness, too, is a certainty which does not possess the truth within itself. And it confesses itself to be such an unessential consciousness, to be of this world and separated from the spirit that is certain of itself and self-authenticated. But it forgets this moment in its immediate spiritual knowledge of absolute being. Enlightenment, however, which reminds it of this, in its turn thinks only of contingent being and forgets the other, thinks only of the mediation which takes place through an alien third term, not of the mediation in which the immediate is itself the third term through which it mediates itself with the other, that is, with its own self. Paragraph 568 continues this Enlightenment critique of faith. There's also a parallelism there towards the end, similar to the previous paragraph, where Hegel himself is adopting a critical stance on Enlightenment. We could talk about this as the negation of the negation, which means that Hegel is not actually taking sides with faith, but using Enlightenment's own critique of faith to point something out within Enlightenment. But the bulk of the focus here, the bulk of the paragraph, has to do with Enlightenment's own critique of faith as a standpoint that is not fully adequate to itself and is coming to realize it as such through the critique that Enlightenment is providing of it. So he says it's clear the same is the case with the ground of knowledge. Faith itself acknowledges a contingent knowledge, for it has a relationship to contingent beings. What do we mean by this? Well, faith is historically bound. And even if we're talking about faiths, religions, that are not particularly, interested in sacred history or something like that, they're still, contingently connected with particular objects or places or rituals or whatever. And through them, one is supposed to gain knowledge of the divine. And if you think about the way that training or catechesis or teaching works, you're being introduced to these contingent things and told perhaps, this is the God, or this symbolizes the God. And you could ask, as children often do, well, why this thing then? Why this and not that thing over there? Why did you make the idol out of this kind of stone instead of making out of this? Why does the sacred text say this instead of saying this other thing? And the answer is generally unsatisfying, at least for thinking people. Well, it just happens to be that way. We don't quite know. Or they come up with some other explanation for it that ends up opening the door to all sorts of other possible interpretations. Well, God chose to manifest himself or itself in this way because of the suitability of this particular thing. I mean, we see great examples of this with discussions within, medieval Christianity. Why did God choose to manifest himself in a man? The argument then is priests can only be men rather than as a woman, and some of the gyrations that theologians go through in trying to explain this are they become a little bit comical, but also a little bit tragic when you realize that they're not great arguments. They're based on suitability that often depends on, well, women are just inferior to men in this respect or that respect. And then you're like, well, what if we don't accept that premise? Then that's the problem with contingent knowledge. We can take a new critical standpoint on it, and that's what Enlightenment, in fact, is doing. So he says, faith acknowledges a contingent knowledge, relationship to contingent things, and absolute being itself exists for faith. And here Hegel has a really interesting phrase. Exists, as how Miller is translating this, a pictorial representation of common reality. Now, the German is a little bit more direct. Vorgestalten, gemeinen Wirklichkeit, right? The Wirklichkeit, reality, actuality, we've seen that term being used a lot. It's interesting that he says gemeinen here instead of other possible things. So it's not universal, it's common. It's not allgemeine, it's gemeinen, right? It is something that belongs to us as a community of religious belief or faith. And then the pictorial representation, that's a sort of circumlocution around the Vorgestalten. It is depicted. It is represented. It is, if we want to be much more direct, it is set out there. It is framed out there, is ways we could think about this. And so we have a common reality, a common actuality is probably a better way of translating this, an actuality that we all agree on to some degree, God in his heaven, or the Trinity, or pick whatever else you like. And this could include the entire cosmos, the world understood as beyond. And we kind of, we all agree about it, but if you ask us what we really mean by what we agree with or how we picture it in our heads, then divergences show up. And then we have to realize the contingency of what it is that we're thinking about. A great example of this is if you look at depictions of the Theotokos in iconography. The Theotokos is Mary depicted as the mother of God. So this is something stemming from Christian theology. And, it was something that was decided at one of the councils. Mary is indeed the Theotokos, the bearer of God. And it was depicted in all sorts of interesting icons. And if you look at iconography, you're going to see stylistic divergences from, within the great, linguistic and ecclesiastical traditions in the church. So, icons in the Syriac speaking churches don't look quite the same as they do in the originally Greek, and then all these other national tongues. Orthodox churches, they don't look quite the same. Most of the Catholic stuff is kind of copied from the Eastern Orthodox, but there is some differences. And then we can talk about, say, the Coptic icons and all that. And that's all within, one overarching oikonomike, one cultural sphere. What happens when you take the Theotokos to China and you depict Mary with the infant Jesus, who's, God, right, within Christianity, in a way that draws upon the aesthetic sensibilities and canon and also other religious ideas of the Chinese cultural sphere. Well, then you get Mary depicted as Guanyin, goddess of mercy, who's actually a Buddhist figure, coming from India originally and then making its way into China. And you could say, somebody encountering that from the West might say, I don't really recognize that as a depiction of the absolute being and the absolute being's mom. Right? They might say, well, this is just, some depiction of a goddess. Or, if they're a little bit more on the ball and they know something about Buddhism, they might talk about that history, how this originally male figure, this bodhisattva, transfers across the Himalayas and becomes a female figure in China. They might not recognize it because of the contingency. And we can go on and on and on about this. This is where, again, a little bit of a digression, hermeneutics comes in, and it's not just hermeneutics of the text, but hermeneutics of culture, figuring out what it is that people actually mean by the things that they are depicting or representing or imagining together. Sometimes we have to reconstitute that together. That's what hermeneutics is about, reestablishing the Gemein. So, I spent a lot of time on that first sentence. Let's go on. He says, consequently, the believing consciousness is a certainty which does not possess the truth within itself, and it confesses itself to be such an unessential consciousness, to be of this world and separated from the spirit that is certain of itself and self-authenticated. So, faith realizes that it is separated from absolute being, even by the very means that it attempts to use to conceptualize and to connect with absolute being. In this case, through knowledge. And, we do see this represented within faith throughout the world religions, discussions about the inadequacy of symbols and analogy to truly reveal to us what the divine is in itself. So he says, it forgets this moment in its immediate spiritual knowledge of absolute being. So faith is oscillating between a realization of its own inadequacy and a sort of being fascinated and forgetting by focusing on the contingent things. So Enlightenment comes in and says, gotcha! Here's the critique. You guys are, taking the divine and representing it in all these ways. This is not a new thing. We've already seen this worked out in paragraph after paragraph before. Now let's look at what Hegel says about Enlightenment itself. This gets really interesting. He says, Enlightenment, which reminds it of this, in its turn thinks only of contingent being and forgets the other. It thinks only of the mediation. This is where it gets a little metaphysical and a little bit methodological, and we got to follow what Hegel's saying here. Thinks only of the mediation which takes place through an alien third term. What is that alien third term? Contingent beings of the world. In the case of Enlightenment, sensuous beings, right? So he says, it takes place through an alien third term, but it doesn't grasp the mediation in which the immediate is itself the third term, through which it mediates itself with the other, that is with its own self. So that, when you read that the first time, you're like, what is he talking about there? Well, let's think about that. It's not thinking of the mediation, in which the immediate is itself the third term, through which it mediates itself with the other. A more complex attitude. The immediacy of faith, for a self-conscious faith, could be understood in terms of its very inadequacy to the divine, but it understands that this is the best that it's got. And it uses that as a way to, in some respect, move beyond itself, but also bring itself along as it moves beyond, to progress, to develop, as we say. So would this get it to the divine? Not necessarily, but it gets it further towards the divine. And Enlightenment is missing out on this. So in a certain respect, it's not only misunderstanding faith, it's misunderstanding what faith does that Enlightenment itself could be doing in relation to its own conception of absolute being and contingent being. It's not understanding itself adequately as a subject.